Hello, people of YouTube, and welcome to Ruben's History Show. So today I'm going to talk about the removal of Soviet General Secretary or First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, who was in power from March 5th, 1953, all the way to October 14th, 1964, when he was removed by top government officials led by Leonid Brezhnev. So, in order to understand why Khrushchev was removed as leader or the first secretary of Communist Party was because of his decisions he made in the Caribbean crisis when the Soviet Union brought missiles into Cuba, and then the United States saw the missiles in Cuba, and they brought pictures back to U.S. President John F. Kennedy, and they showed it to Kennedy, and Kennedy's like, we need to tell Soviet Union to get the missiles out of Cuba, and so Soviet Union did not listen, and so that it would result into a nuclear war between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And so then Khrushchev was given this huge risks, like if to take the missiles out of Cuba or keep them there, or if the United States invaded Cuba, that meant that the Soviet Union would send a nuke over to United States, and it would result into a nuclear war between the two major superpowers, and so that would start a nuclear war, an all-out nuclear war between the two powers. And so October, by October 27th, 1962, the missiles were taken out of Cuba when Nikita Khrushchev made an announcement on radio, Moscow radio, and he told that the missiles were taken out of Cuba, and also the United States put Jupiter nuclear missiles next in Italy and Turkey, which were next to the USSR. And so and then there were no nukes launched at each other at the Soviet Union or United States. And so a lot of government officials in the Soviet Union were not happy with Khrushchev for the decisions he was given in the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Caribbean Crisis of 1962. So then government officials started planning against Khrushchev. They wanted to remove him from power because of his decisions he made in the Caribbean crisis, and so they would take him down, and they would force him to retire 2 years later in 1964 by government officials when he returned from his vacation in Pitsanda, Georgia. So basically, he was on vacation before he came to Moscow, because while he was in Georgia during most of that time. He was in Georgia and other Soviet Georgia, and he was in other countries, other Eastern Bloc countries like East Germany and Czechoslovakia, which were two Eastern Bloc countries. He was in the beginning of 1960. I think it was between 1963 and 1964. He was mostly out of the USSR. So, and then government officials started planning to remove Khrushchev. They wanted to take Khrushchev down and replace him with somebody else, and so, and then government officials. It was in the spring. I believe it was in spring of 1964. This government officials led by Comrade Brezhnev started planning to remove Khrushchev while Khrushchev was away from the Soviet Union, while he was in the other Eastern Bloc countries. And so, but then by October of 1964, so Comrade Khrushchev was in Pitsanda, Georgia, so he was on vacation. And that was a part of USSR at the time. Georgia is right next to the border of Azerbaijan, Soviet Azerbaijan, or Soviet Armenia, which were the two former Soviet republics of those two of that country. And so Khrushchev received a phone call from Moscow, and they told him that he needed to return to Moscow about the agriculture situation. So that's one of the reasons why Khrushchev had to come back, and there was going to be a new succession of a Soviet leader in Moscow. And so Khrushchev left Georgia, the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, and so he returned to Moscow, which was part of the U.S., which was the capital of the USSR at the time. And so Khrushchev returned there. He was welcomed by this chairman of the KGB, Vladimir Semychasmy, who was the chairman of the KGB before Andropov took over in 1967. So that was just 3 years after Khrushchev was removed from power as the leader of the USSR. And they informed him about the situation that's taking place in Moscow. So while he returned to Moscow in 1964, October 1964, so he was removed from power as leader of the country. And he was replaced by Alexei Kosygin as the premier of the USSR. So he was basically like the second in command. And then Leonid Brezhnev became the new first secretary of Communist Party of Soviet Union. So that basically meant that he was the leader of the nation at that period. So Khrushchev was removed and he was sent to his retirement. He was forced out of politics in Soviet Union, and he retired from politics. And he resigned as leader of the Soviet Union. So after he was removed from power, he began to write memories of his life, like in the war, like in World War II, for example. And so he made books about his memories about his life, and about like he was fighting, for example, like in the World War II when he was fighting against the Germans during World War II from the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945. And then he also recorded some of his memories on tape, I believe, on a tape recorder. But then at the time, this tapes were taken by the KGB at the time, and so Khrushchev refused to give them to the KGB, but KGB took the recorded tapes away from Khrushchev while he was in retirement as leader of the country. That was just 2 years after he was removed in power. So he began his stories in 1966. So that meant basically after 2 years after he was removed from office as the first secretary of Communist Party of the USSR. But then later on on September 11th, 1971, Khrushchev died at the age of 77 in Moscow. He died at the age of 77 in Moscow. And he was given a state funeral. And then he was not buried in the Kremlin walls, like, for example, the other leaders like Andropov, Stalin, and Brezhnev, and Chernenko. They were not Khrushchev was not buried in the Kremlin wall. He was buried in cemetery. I don't remember the exact name. He was buried in some cemetery in Moscow. I don't know the exact name of it though. So that's how Khrushchev got removed as leader of the Soviet Union. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in future videos. So I'll see you guys there.